everyone, this is update for November 16, 2022, day 266 of the war and of the date update. Today was a fairly quiet date on the front line, and also just generally in Ukraine, I would say. I will discuss a little bit strategic sort of questions and topics, and then we're gonna talk a little bit more about what's going on in Ukraine. So first, let's talk about the energy, which is very important and where a lot of the problems are coming from that generate this whole inflation. And specifically, I just want to reiterate this war on conventional energy. And the way I just want to explain how this works. So basically, if their government enacts the policy that is hostile to the conventional oil production, right, then the companies that produce conventional energy, they will not invest money, right? And if you don't invest money, then you have declining production of the conventional energy. Let's say let's just talk about the crude oil, right? So you have, because there is a large lead time and huge amounts needed to be invested in order to maintain crude oil production. And if you reduce your spend on maintaining that production, then it will drop, and then we have shortages, right? And in general, there is a shortage. There's generally less of the crude oil in the world. Just to explain, like in a simple term, why there is simply less, and we anyways going into shortages. So even let's say if we are investing more money and trying to maintain that production, we are sort of getting towards I'm not saying the end, but we definitely past sort of cheap and easy oil and plentiful oil. And let me explain you why this true. Because let's say if you look in the past how oil was produced, you just drill oil, you basically poke a hole, and there is a reservoir under the ground, and you suck it out, right? So just basically like big bubble. Think about this like big bubble under the ground, and you just suck out the oil from that bubble. So that's how was in the past. Let's say till I would say late, till about 2007, 8, 9, 10. However, that oil was production was declining because there were fewer and fewer those opportunities. So what happened then is there is a so-called revolution called in oil production, and actually in natural gas too. But let's just focus on crude oil because that's in some ways more important. So then fracking came into sort of commercial use, because fracking has been known before, so it's not like something totally new. It was just unprofitable in the past, and so it wasn't used because there was plenty of sort of conventional oil, right? So there's just bubbles that you suck out of them, that oil, and everything's fine. So what fracking is in a simple way is think like that you have a sponge that's soaked up in oil, right? So, and what you do, and this is maybe not perfect comparison because you're not really squeeze it, but essentially what you're doing, you're squeezing oil out of that sponge. So instead of like nice, like ideal bubble of oil that you just simply suck out, you actually put effort to squeeze that oil out of that sponge. And because you put effort into it, that really means you spend more money, right? So you put more energy into it to extract that energy that you're gonna get. So what this really also means is that easy oil, cheap oil is getting sort of, there is less and less of it, and the world is more and more relying on this kind of like oil that's sort of in the sponges. And to be exactly how it works, Yeah, so it's kind of like a sponge, like a bubbles, tiny bubbles, and then with the fracking, you basically blow up those bubbles, and the oil is kind of like, going and you um, sucking it out. In some ways, it's like think about like the oil trapped in honeycombs, and you just break the walls between honeycombs, and you extract, you take that honey out, and this is kind of like in a way a very similar process in some ways. But first of all, you're not extracting perfectly everything. You spend a lot of effort blowing up those walls. You have a lot of side effects that's not terribly sort of, well, I would say it's quite not environmentally friendly. It creates artificial earthquakes, so there's a lot of side effects of it. However, as a humanity, we're desperate enough to do this kind of sort of less safe things. Let's put this way. So, so that's what's been going on. That's just generally that we sort of going back to the whole idea is that we already were in a difficult situation without even this hostile energy policies. So what these hostile energy policies do, they magnify difficult situation on top, on top of it. So they basically notching it up. So as a result, as you can see that even the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates, right? We got almost to 4% at this point. Mortgages in the US, like around 7% now. They a little bit down, a little bit under 7, but it's all very high. But at the same time, you see that crude oil doesn't quite go down by that much, and that's just because there's not enough of it. There's a shortage of crude oil for the world demand. Just let's say look at what's going on in the US. So US has this strategic petroleum reserve. Basically, it's just old those bubbles that were from which the oil was sucked out in the past, whatever, I don't know, 50, 100 years, not 100, probably 80 years ago. So the capacity of those call it bubbles or storage underground, basically nature created underground storage facilities, is slightly above 800 million barrels. US is using slightly under 20, so like 19, I think 0.5, 6, 8, depending on the year. But basically, let's just count it as 20. So this is essentially like like 40 days of the supply for the entire US. If something happens, you stop all of the production, the country can still live for 40 days. So what happens with this? Oh, and by the way, in terms of how much oil, how much energy, let's say, US is producing is about like 18.5. So there's a shortage of 1 point something, 1.2345 million barrels per day in the US. So basically US is net importer. Out of that 18, about 10% is actually, a little bit less than 10% is basically energy made from corn, which is ethanol. So not all of it is sort of crude oil, basically. So what happens is then there is another sort of problem with all of this is that U.S. government was essentially artificially suppressing price of crude oil and obviously all the derivative products such as gasoline, diesel fuel, etc. By basically releasing crude oil from this strategic petroleum reserve. So, as I said, it's 800 million barrels, the whole capacity, slightly above, like, I don't know, what, 820, 830, whatever, something. But let's just like use round numbers so it's easy to sort of follow this. So it was nearly full in November of 2011 and 725 million. And right now, the most recent number, it dropped to 392 million barrels. This is the lowest number since 1984. So as you can imagine, there's like quite a bit of problem brewing from sort of all angles with respect to oil, right? And what this really means is that even Federal Reserve, this is why I'm trying to explain that, like, even Federal Reserve is trying to sort of increase interest rates. uh, Prices may not go down as much, because simply there is no availability of physical product. And in order to kind of like then make it sort of, how to say, balanced with your supply and demand, you really need to destroy a lot of demand, right? So because supply is still constrained, so the only way is to destroy quite a bit of demand. And this has started to be happening. And I'm using US because US has a lot of good quality statistical data relative to the rest of the world. So it's really easy to see, and it's largest economy, so it becomes sort of perfect target for analysis. And so the demand destruction already started, in US, because you probably have heard there are a lot of companies starting announcing layoffs and so on. And the other problem in the sort of US, and it's the same probably around, let's say in the rest of the Western world, is that inflation has been like close to 10%. And if you really look, because also the inflation measure is not, in a way, it's it's like like how to say, people say one size does not fit all, but that's what really that inflation measure CPI is. It's like one size for everyone, right? So, and that's never true in life. You never, like, this approach never works, because you have a lot of people who don't really feel as much, and then people who feel at much higher level, those who are at the bottom in terms of their incomes. So in a way, it's very crude measure, but that's unfortunately being used. So what happens is that inflation for especially those, like, let's say bottom 50%, is really more than 10%, more like 15, and something like that, plus minus. At the same time, the way the wages were growing, it's less than 5%. So as you can see, let's say 15 minus 5, like you negative 10%. That's the loss of the sort of purchasing capacity, just basically reduction in the living standards for significant portions of population. So this is basically like, like, let's say we're modeling this sort of consumer, and something similar happening in the UK, in Europe. Don't know as much about Japan, but pretty sure that something similar is there as well. So as you can see, this consumer is, totally feeling the pain of this situation. So what happens next is that all of these consumers, at least in the US, what they do, they go and they try to maintain their lifestyle, and they just go and use credit cards, sort of like very short-term borrowing, of like whatever months or 2 months time, just to kind of keep them afloat. Because there's another sort of source of where many of the consumers in the US would get sort of their spending power, is they basically extract equity from their houses. Basically, whatever they pay down, they would basically borrow that. So they basically reverse all of that pay down, and then they spend that money. But that works only when housing prices rising, right? And that sort of engine is broken, because with high interest rates, your housing prices are, they already started going down, right? You cannot have high housing prices. By the way, if anyone interested, I can basically show how you can almost sort of scientifically predict at what interest rates how much the housing prices should fall. So if there is enough interest, I can show it next time, how that's the whole thing works. But anyways, so basically, let's go back to the consumer. So it's broken from all angles in terms of their actually, salaries don't go up. You squeeze there. you cannot get money from your house. So that really what happens is that fuels eventually social unrest. So right now, like people trying to kind of like get by, survive, just thinking like, okay, this is just me, I'll just get by and something gets better. But the problem is that this in high interest, well, they not even high interest rates that Federal Reserve is basically pushing on the economy. They probably will stay for a while because, as you can see, the supply of energy is constrained. So that will essentially ensure that um, interest rates need to stay relatively high for a long period of time. And so that really means that these people will get more and more squeezed, and eventually it may lead to social unrest in the West. And just another like data points to sort of prove how people are sort of stretched for cash. So Airbnb, which probably many of you know what it is, it's just basically people you can put your whatever it is, some real estate on it and rent it, short-term rentals to get extra money, right, for the owner of the real estate. Airbnb saw extremely unusual jump of 31% in one bedroom rentals, which giving this whole other situation that I explained is really means that people trying to earn extra money, extra cash, whichever they want to get it, right? Now let's talk a little bit, switch a little bit and talk about inflation in not in the US, which looks like it's peaking or has peaked. But what's going on in the UK and maybe Italy? So UK reported CPI of 11.1% in October. This is year on year. And in September it was 10.1. So you can see it's 1% increase, pretty significant increase. However, even though this is, you see this increase, PPI actually is trending down. And what PPI is a purchasing price index. Basically, this is what manufacturers are paying to get their resources, raw goods. Yeah, I guess you can call it raw, say raw inventory, I guess. Basically, this is what kind of like gets into the system. Then manufacturer processes inventory, and then they sell it, and that's in the end you will see CPI. So basically, this is kind of like a leading indicator of what's gonna happen to CPI. And basically, this PPI is trending down in the UK. So we probably will see also inflation peaking in the UK. I don't know how quickly, maybe in 2 months, maybe in a month, maybe in 3 months, but at some point, unless we obviously have some kind of shocks. And then in Italy, the sort of also on surface inflation is also rising. So it was, and still pretty sharply. It went up from 8.9 in September to 11.8 in October. So I guess Italy in some ways still a little bit sort of catching up to all of that inflation. But you can clearly see that some countries like US already kind of like crossed the peak. UK is about to, and then Italy still inertia is there. Then actually let's switch a little bit to Russia and what's going on there. And there is basically, it's also going into inflationary sort of spiral because what's happening, Russian central bank is effectively financing huge budget deficits of the Russian government, and that the way it's done a very sort of concealed way. So what happens is Russian central bank basically gives like repo loans, basically gives loans to the regular commercial banks, and then those commercial banks then go and buy government debt, basically provide financing to government. So basically it's kind of like how to say, they basically recycle this money that the central bank gives them, and they put them into the government debt. and the size of this issuance is pretty big. I think 1.3 trillion rubles. You know, that's not small change. So basically, what I've said before is that before Russian budget, Russian everything was financial system in pristine condition. But now it's getting more and more sort of out of control, and situation will get worse progressively and pretty quickly. I don't know, if not in December, then January, February. So basically, Russia is going, faster and faster into some sort of like inflationary disaster episode. And then obviously all of this inflation, and why I'm focused on so much on inflation is because that really leads to the social unrest and frequently to collapse of the countries. Because I mentioned this before, as Lenin said, the best way to destroy society is to debauch its currency. And by what the way you debauch the country's currency is by having high inflation. So that's basically another way of saying, like, by having high inflation, you destroy society, you destroy the country. And so Russia is firmly on that path, giving the all other problems. That's why I'm saying about this 1917 moment that Russia goes towards, and Ukraine, which has extremely, corrupt and inept government. Let's put it this way, as we can see. And by the way, actually, oh, and one last thing, and then we'll switch to Ukraine a little bit more. So there was this. I spoke about this G20 meeting. The interesting part there is that the tension between the UK and China is so high that UK Prime Minister and Chinese President did not meet at all. At the same time, Chinese President met with I think Italian Prime Minister, French President, obviously Scholz before, Canadian was the Prime Minister, even though it was kind of very unpleasant exchange probably for Canadian Prime Minister. But nevertheless, they met. But the tensions are definitely still on the rise between China and sort of this Western coalition. Now let's switch back to Ukraine. So as I mentioned yesterday, it did not look like it was Russian caliber missile, because it has 500 kilograms of explosive, and the crater did not look like that. So it was confirmed that it was probably Ukrainian anti-air missile that was trying to shoot down one of those Russian missiles. And because it is Soviet technology, it's not surprising that it kind of like went some other ways. Let's put it this way. So I would just blame Soviet technology for all of this, because that's not sort of unusual for it. Unfortunately, at the same time, Ukrainian sort of top government is again shown that they completely inept, incompetent by not really admitting their reality and trying to address it in sort of straight, normal way. Nothing makes you sort of worse than trying to sort of lie straight against the facts. Unfortunately, that's what Ukraine got as its sort of leadership, as its government. And then just want to mention about Ukrainian electricity distribution network. It's the blackouts becoming sort of longer and longer. It still like doesn't look like the system disintegrated into islands, but it certainly got closer to that moment, because the blackouts starting to be like 12 hours and more, depending on the regions. But for example, this western regions used to be in better shape, So there would be, the blackouts would be very short and so on. But the rest, especially this central and northern part of the country, really suffering mightily from those blackouts, because the most of the attacks is, I think I didn't discuss it, but most of the attacks are centered around basically Kiev, basically cutting off energy supply to the capital. Essentially, that's the focus of all of these attacks. I'm not saying the rest of the countries sort of got sort of their fair share of those attacks, but definitely Kiev got much more than the rest of the country. Now let's actually switch to the front line. We're going to do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, starting from the very north. So the situation along the state border is more or less the same, some level of artillery activity, but it's definitely subdued. Now let's jump to this North Luhansk front line. Things here are somewhat quieter. There was just very weak Ukrainian attack around Kuzemivka. Didn't go anywhere. Otherwise, the situation is more or less positional, sort of positional fighting, where this mostly just artillery fights and so on, and reconnaissance groups. Now let's move south. Let's see what's going on the North Donbass front line. Things here are also much quieter. So it looks like just, I think, couple places where Wagner mercenaries still attacking. So just this Belogorivka and south here, Kurdyumivka. But if you watched previous videos, this is very extremely low level of activity for the Wagner mercenaries. And again, the situation remained the same, status quo. They haven't advanced anywhere. Now let's move to central Donbass front line. Things here are surprisingly quite active. As you can see, Russian command is really trying to achieve something around this Avdiivka, and essentially trying to take control of Avdiivka. These attacks didn't go anywhere. Then, also typical attacks in Marinka didn't go anywhere. Here in Novomikhailivka. The only new difference is that Russian troops are trying now. They stopped the suicidal attacks from Pavlivka towards Vuhledar, and they're trying to kind of attack Vuhledar from the flank. Wasn't successful so far, but I'm sure they will try a new area. And similar idea here, attacks towards Velika Novosivka. So as you can see, they're trying now to attack from the flanks instead of the frontal attacks to reduce the losses, because they probably cannot afford heavy losses, even with the large number of the conscripts. Now let's finish with the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are still quiet. No new news about the arrival of the new units from both sides. So things still pretty quiet here for now. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye bye.